Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a mountain of information and distill it down to those glittering nuggets of insight you need to be truly well-informed. Today, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a time before July 4th, 1776, a time when the very idea of American independence was still just a whisper, a radical, almost unthinkable notion, really, brewing in pockets of colonial America. Now, open your mind to a little-known, fiercely debated piece of that history, an alleged Declaration of Independence supposedly penned more than a year before the one we all celebrate, right in the heart of Mecklenburg County, North Carolina.
Indeed. It's a fascinating story, complex, deeply controversial, often referred to as the Meck deck. And this deep dive, well, it's going to unravel that very controversy. We're going to explore the historical context that set the stage. We'll delve into the motivations of the people involved, these early settlers who found themselves really at the precipice of rebellion. And then we'll rigorously examine the compelling arguments both for and against its existence.
Right. And crucially, we'll introduce its less disputed but still incredibly radical sibling document, the Mecklenburg Resolves. Our mission today isn't to take sides in this centuries-old historical debate. Not at all. But rather to help you, our listener, understand the foundational claims, the very real people who made them, and the evidence, or lack thereof, that has fueled this historical mystery for generations. We want to truly understand what compelled a group of citizens in a seemingly quiet frontier county to contemplate such a radical, dangerous step.
It's about peeling back the layers, isn't it? To see the powerful social and political forces at play, the human element behind these monumental declarations, potentially, and the societal pressures that could drive individuals to declare themselves free from a distant crown. What was life like for them? Why did they feel such an urgent need to act?
That's the heart of it. That's exactly it. To truly grasp the radical nature of these claims, we first need to understand the very soil from which they sprang, Mecklenburg County itself. What was this frontier like in the mid-1700s?
Okay, so Mecklenburg County was one of the earliest backcountry counties in the colony of North Carolina. To set the scene, you have to imagine this as a rugged, kind of untamed frontier in the mid-1700s. The general area first saw significant settlement in the 1750s, largely by Scots-Irish immigrants. Many had initially settled further north in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. They were seeking new lands, religious freedom, and, an escape from the increasingly crowded and regulated coastal areas. This was a period where the pioneering spirit, that deep desire for self-reliance, a strong work ethic, the drive to carve out a new life was really starting to clash with the often heavy-handed and distant rule of the British colonial administration. These settlers, well, they were accustomed to making their own way. They had little patience for absentee landlords or arbitrary regulations.
So it wasn't just a physical frontier, but also a cultural one, really fostering a unique sense of independence. And it quickly gained its own formal structure, albeit with a touch of irony when you look at how things eventually turned out.
Precisely. Mecklenburg County was officially formed in 1763, carved out of the much larger Anson County. Then, in 1768, its principal city, Charlotte, was founded. And here's where that irony you mentioned comes in. Both the county and the city were named in honor of Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She had just become the new bride of King George III of England.
Wow, imagine that.
Yeah, imagine naming your town and county after the wife of the very king you'd soon be contemplating rebellion against only a few short years later. It really underscores just how quickly relations deteriorated between the colonies and the mother country.
That's a striking detail. It really is.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how quickly that sense of loyalty might have eroded. By the spring of 1775, historical accounts tell us that talk of freedom from British rule was prevalent throughout Mecklenburg County. This wasn't some isolated, sudden outburst. This was a growing, simmering sentiment, part of what historians describe as a larger rural rebellion that spanned from 1773 to 1775 across various backcountry regions in North Carolina and other colonies, too.
That's a crucial point. The events in Mecklenburg didn't happen in a vacuum. Absolutely not. They were a local manifestation of a broader, mounting frustration that had been building for years. This rural rebellion wasn't a formal, organized military campaign, but more a series of localized protests, acts of defiance against perceived injustices. For these frontier communities, British rule often manifested as, burdensome taxes, unfair land practices, corrupt local officials, a lack of adequate representation or protection. They felt neglected and exploited, which fueled a deep-seated desire for self-governance and local control. The stage was, it was well and truly set for something significant to happen.
And who are the people standing on that stage, ready to take such a radical step? The accounts refer to them as the Mecklenburg signers, a varied but clearly influential group within their community. While we don't have detailed biographies for all of them, the list of names itself gives us a sense of the community involved. You have to think of them as the local leadership, right? The pillars of this frontier society who bore the brunt of these British policies.
Yes, the names listed are quite telling. And there are quite a few Alexanders. You've got Abraham, Adam, Charles, Ezra, Hezekiah, and John McNitt Alexander. Then there's Waitstill Avery, Hezekiah Balch, Richard Berry, Ephraim Brevard. We also find John Davidson, Henry Downs, John Flanagan, John Ford, William Graham, James Harris, Richard Harris, Robert Irwin, William Kennan, Matthew McClure, Neil Morrison, Duncan Ochiltree, Benjamin Patton, John Pfeiffer, Thomas Polk, John Query, David Reese, and Zacchaeus Wilson. This wasn't just a random collection of individuals, it was like a cross-section of the county's established citizenry.
That's quite a roster. It really is. And what's interesting is that while they might not be household names like the Philadelphia signers, existing documents paint a clear picture of their standing in the community. Historical records, things like wills and deeds for several of these individuals like various Alexanders, Henry Downs, Matthew McClure, David Reese, indicate they were established property owners, often with substantial land holdings. In a frontier society, land ownership, well, that equated to wealth, influence, and a tangible stake in the community's future. These weren't transient figures. They were deeply invested in Mecklenburg.
Exactly. And furthermore, the fact that two of the eyewitnesses to the events, who later provided testimony, were ordained Presbyterian ministers underscores the involvement of highly respected community leaders. The Presbyterian Church played a significant role in the cultural and political life of these Scots-Irish communities. They often served as intellectual centers, fostering a strong sense of community and moral uprightness. Ministers were often educated individuals, influential in shaping public opinion, and their involvement lends considerable weight to the claims made. Their presence suggests that this was not merely a secular political act, but one imbued with a deeper moral, perhaps even religious conviction.
So, given their deep roots and prominent standing in this frontier community, it begs the question, why would these particular individuals feel so compelled to take such a radical step as declaring independence, especially when it hadn't even been widely discussed at a continental level yet?
Well, it wasn't a decision made lightly, obviously, but it was driven by a powerful confluence of factors. These individuals, deeply connected to the land and their fellow settlers, had literally built their lives and fortunes there. This very connection meant they likely felt the impact of distant British rule much more acutely than, say, those in established coastal cities. The taxes, the regulations, the perceived injustices, these weren't abstract concepts debated in distant assemblies. No. They directly affected their livelihoods, their ability to expand their farms, to trade, to govern their own affairs, and ultimately their vision for self-determination. They had chosen this land, invested their lives and labor in it, and now they sought control over their own destiny, free from the dictates of a monarch thousands of miles away. Their identities were just so tied to their local community and its autonomy, and they were ready to defend that autonomy, really, at all costs. This ethos of self-reliance, honed on the frontier, made the idea of breaking from external authority a more natural, perhaps even inevitable progression for them.
It truly makes sense when you put it like that. They had literally built their lives and fortunes there. And speaking of individuals who played a pivotal role in enacting this defiance, we have to talk about Captain James Jack, often referred to as an unsung messenger of rebellion.
Captain Jack, yes. As he was popularly known later due to his rank in the county militia. He had a truly fascinating background that kind of typified many early American settlers. He was the eldest of 9 children of Irish immigrants, the Jacks, who had come to America around 1730. Part of that great wave of Scots-Irish fleeing economic hardship and religious persecution in Ulster. This detail is important because it highlights that immigrant experience, so foundational to early America people seeking new opportunities and freedoms, often fleeing oppression, and then finding new forms of it in their adopted home. Their willingness to uproot and embark on a perilous journey across the Atlantic imbued many of these families with a robust independence and a deep distrust of distant centralized authority.
And he wasn't just passing through. The Jack family moved to Charlotte around 1772, quickly establishing a local presence by opening a tavern known as Pat Jack's. This is a small detail maybe, but it paints a vivid picture of a family putting down roots, becoming part of the local fabric. A tavern, especially in a frontier town, wasn't just a place for drinks. It was the social and information hub of the community, wasn't it? Where news, political grievances, revolutionary sentiments would be openly discussed.
Absolutely. Taverns were vital social and political centers of the time, often serving as informal meeting places for local committees and, well, revolutionaries. It makes Captain Jack an ideal candidate for the critical and incredibly dangerous task assigned to him in the summer of 1775. He was instructed to go express to Congress with a copy of all SNE resolutions and laws, etc., and a letter to our three members there, Richard Caswell, William Hooper, and Joseph Hughes, in order to get Congress to sanction or approve them. This wasn't merely a delivery, it was a diplomatic mission of the highest stakes.
Let's pause on that for a moment. This wasn't just a casual trip, like you said. Historical accounts emphasize the immense risk involved. The road to Philadelphia was nearly 560 miles. That's a formidable journey even today, let alone in the 18th century. What would that journey have actually entailed, and why was it so fraught with danger?
Well, to fully appreciate the peril, you have to imagine the conditions of 1775. There were no paved roads, just rudimentary dirt paths, often muddy, dusty, depending on the weather. Travel by horseback was slow, arduous, maybe 20, 30 miles a day on a good stretch. So Captain Jack's journey would have taken weeks. He would have faced dense forests, unreliable ferries across rivers, the constant threat of wild animals. But the human danger was far more immediate. The colonies were a patchwork of shifting loyalties. The roads were teeming with not only ordinary travelers, but also British agents, loyalists, bandits, all posed a threat.
And if he was caught, what would have been the consequences of carrying what you called seditious documents?
Well, if Captain Jack had been caught carrying what would have been considered seditious documents from Mecklenburg papers, explicitly challenging British authority, or, potentially declaring independence, he would have faced immediate arrest,
Mhm.
and very likely hanging for high treason. The British Crown viewed any act of rebellion as a direct affront to its authority, punishable by the severest means. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just for him, but for the entire Mecklenburg Committee. And we know the British government was aware of such activities because Governor Josiah Martin, the royal governor of North Carolina, himself informed London in August 1775 that he had been informed that treasonable resolves had been sent off by express to the Congress at Philadelphia as soon as they were passed in the committee. So this wasn't some secret plot. It was a defiant act in plain sight, with severe potential consequences. Captain Jack would have had to travel discreetly, perhaps disguising his true purpose, concealing the documents, relying on scattered networks of sympathetic colonists for aid and shelter. It was an extraordinary act of courage.
That truly sets the scene for the gravity of the situation, and it brings us right to the core of this deep dive. What exactly was the spark? What compelled these individuals, this community, to consider such a drastic measure as declaring independence, essentially putting their lives on the line?
Well, as we noted, by the spring of 1775, talk of freedom from British rule was prevalent in Mecklenburg County. It was in the air. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of that larger mounting frustration with British policy and control. The Rural Rebellion 1773-1775 context is key here. It highlights that an anti-British sentiment was widespread, even in the backcountry, far from the coastal centers. These rural communities felt especially burdened by British policies that favored merchants and landowners closer to the coast, leaving them with little representation or recourse. People weren't just discussing their grievances, they were actively seeking ways to assert control over their own lives, to find remedies for their economic and political disenfranchisement.
So the impulse driving all of this was a clear move towards self-determination. They wanted to reorganize their local government, to take power into their own hands, away from the distant British crown and its perceived injustices.
Exactly. But there were also very specific, direct catalysts that propelled these individuals to act decisively. According to John McNitt Alexander's Rough Notes, a crucial short conference took place. And the topic: the profoundly disturbing news of their suffering brethren besieged and suffering every hardship in Boston and the American blood running in Lexington. These were not abstract political debates about taxation or representation anymore. These were reports of actual violence, real bloodshed inflicted upon fellow colonists by British forces. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, fought on April 19, 1775, less than a month before the alleged Meck was a shocking escalation. It signaled that armed conflict had truly begun.
So the news from Lexington and Boston wasn't just information. It was a profound emotional trigger, even for those hundreds of miles away in a frontier county. Alexander noted that the electrical fire flew into every breast. That's such a powerful description, isn't it? It captures a moment of shared, visible outrage and a collective resolve stemming directly from perceived injustices and violence. How quickly would such news have traveled to Mecklenburg? And what would that electrical fire have looked like on the ground?
Yeah, it really speaks to a communal awakening, a realization that the conflict was no longer distant but deeply personal, an affront to their shared identity as Americans. News, though slow by our standards, traveled effectively through a network of express riders, letters, printed pamphlets. While it might have taken a week or two for the detailed news of Lexington and Concord to reach Mecklenburg, the impact would have been immediate and profound. Imagine the discussions in taverns like Pat Jack's, the urgent sermons from Presbyterian pulpits, the hushed conversations among neighbors. The electrical fire describes a sudden, widespread indignation, a collective sense that a line had been crossed. This wasn't just political disagreement, it felt like a direct attack on their rights and lives, demanding an equally direct and powerful response. And this shared resolve led directly to a decisive action, which Alexander documented as a solemn and awful vote. We dissolved, abjured our allegiance to King George and the British nation. This quote, if accurate, is the core declaration of intent. It explains their overwhelming compulsion to declare independence a full year before Philadelphia.
And this brings us to the two documents at the heart of our story: the alleged Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence and the undisputed Mecklenburg Resolves. First, the bold claim. It's asserted that on May 20, 1775, Mecklenburg was the first government body in America to declare independence from the Crown of England.
That's the claim. This alleged document reportedly declared the people of Mecklenburg County independent of the Crown of Great Britain and outlined how they would reorganize their local government. It's said to have established new laws, provisional offices to govern their newly proclaimed independent status. If this claim is true, it would dramatically predate the widely accepted July 4th, 1776 Declaration of Independence signed in Philadelphia. It completely shifts our understanding of the timeline of American independence. It's a truly audacious claim for a frontier county, suggesting a level of foresight and boldness that was, well, extraordinary for the time. Such a declaration would have instantly transformed Mecklenburg from a British colonial county into a self-governing entity, asserting its sovereignty in a way no other colony or county committee had yet dared to do.
But then, just 11 days later, a document emerged whose existence is not disputed: the Mecklenburg Resolves. This document was enacted by the Mecklenburg County Committee of Safety on May 31st, 1775.
Yes, the resolves. And they were incredibly radical in their own right, even if they later became the basis for skepticism regarding the Mecklenburg. They began by declaring that all laws derived from the authority of a king or parliament are annulled and vacated within Mecklenburg County. That's an explicit and unequivocal rejection of British authority, effectively dismantling the existing legal framework imposed by the Crown. It wasn't merely a protest, it was an act of legal nullification.
And it went much further than just annulment, didn't it? The resolves established a provisional government, stating unequivocally that the provincial government under the Great Continental Congress is invested with all legislative and executive powers, and that no other legislative or executive does or can exist at this time in any of these colonies. What did this mean in practical terms for the people of Mecklenburg?
Yes, they were essentially saying, we are taking control. Now, in practical terms, this meant that all power from making laws to enforcing them was now vested in the hands of the local committees, theoretically under the distant umbrella of the Continental Congress. The resolves detailed how this provisional government would function. They organized the county into militia companies, appointed officers, mandated that any person who aided the British Crown would be deemed an enemy to this country. They established a system of local courts and magistrates, effectively taking over the functions previously performed by royal officials. This wasn't just a statement, it was a blueprint for a new, self-governing society.
And they didn't stop at Mecklenburg's borders. The resolves also suspended the actions of royal military and civil officials and called for other colonies to govern themselves through provincial congresses. In a particularly bold move, they even urged other colonies to arrest royal officials who continued their political duties in North Carolina. Was this call to arrest royal officials ever acted upon?
Well, direct evidence of widespread arrests solely based on the resolves is limited. But the sentiment itself was a profound act of defiance. It signaled a shift from passive resistance to active confrontation, urging colonists to disarm and dismantle the very instruments of royal authority. This was a clear call to action, not just for themselves, but for all colonies, inviting them to join in a collective rejection of King George III's rule. Such a directive, if widely adopted, would have completely paralyzed British administration across the colonies.
And unlike the elusive Meck the Mecklenburg Resolves were published. This document appeared in the North Carolina Gazette in New Bern on June 16, 1775, and was subsequently reprinted in other newspapers, like the South Carolina Gazette. This made it a tangible, undeniable act of defiance against the king, sent out for all to see, not just in Mecklenburg, but throughout the colonies.
Exactly. This public dissemination is a critical piece of evidence and differentiates it significantly from the alleged declaration in the minds of many historians. It leaves an undeniable paper trail of radical action, showing that the Mecklenburg leaders were not afraid to broadcast their rejection of British rule far and wide. The fact that it was published widely suggests a deliberate attempt to influence and encourage other communities to follow suit, solidifying its place as a truly revolutionary document.
Whether it was one document or two, the spirit of defiance in Mecklenburg County was undeniable. Absolutely. It's a spirit that earned Charlotte an enduring nickname, the Hornet's Nest.
Ah, yes, the hornet's nest. This moniker comes from a famous anecdote involving Lord Cornwallis, a key British general during the Revolutionary War. In the fall of 1780, Cornwallis arrived in Charlotte with the intention of destroying the Continental Army and pacifying the rebellious North Carolina backcountry. His objective was to use Charlotte as a base for British operations. However, historical accounts tell us he only stayed 16 days. Why? Because the local partisans were just too hot for him. This vividly highlights the fierce, unwavering spirit of independence and self-governance that characterized the area.
So who were these local partisans, and what made them too hot for one of Britain's most formidable generals?
Well, these were not professional soldiers of the Continental Army, mostly. They were local militiamen and irregular forces, farmers, tradesmen, community leaders who had organized themselves to defend their homes and their newfound autonomy. They employed classic guerrilla tactics, ambushing British foraging parties, harassing their supply lines, launching hit-and-run attacks. They knew the terrain intimately, received widespread support from the local populace, and just melted back into the countryside as quickly as they appeared. For Cornwallis's army, accustomed to conventional warfare, this constant, unpredictable harassment was incredibly frustrating and draining. Every day they were in Charlotte, they faced relentless resistance, making it impossible to consolidate their position or move effectively.
And it was Cornwallis himself who later referred to Charlotte as a hornet's nest of rebellion, which is how Charlotte earned its nickname, the Hornet's Nest City, a name it still proudly carries today. It's a powerful testament to the area's deep-seated commitment to resisting British authority, regardless of which specific document historians ultimately agree upon.
It certainly provides a strong argument for the prevailing sentiment of radical independence, yeah? Even if the precise historical document itself remains in question. This anecdote cements Mecklenburg County's place as a hotbed of revolutionary fervor, a place where local citizens were not only willing to declare their defiance, but also actively fight for it.
And that leads us perfectly into the enduring controversy itself. Was the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence fact, folklore, or simply a case of remarkable foresight?
Right. And the central problem, the biggest piece of evidence against the existence of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, is simple. No original copy of the document exists. This absence of a tangible artifact forms the bedrock of the skeptic's case. In historical research, primary source documents are paramount for verification. Without that original piece of paper, the burden of proof becomes exceptionally high.
Okay, but proponents of the Meck explain this away. They attribute the loss of the original records to a fire at the home of John McNett Alexander in 1800. So the argument goes it did exist, but it was tragically destroyed.
Right. But for skeptics, that explanation, while plausible, isn't sufficient to definitively prove its existence. Their argument is quite direct and rooted in the principles of historical methodology. Without the original document, the story is unprovable. It becomes a matter of historical verification, and the primary source, the alleged declaration itself, simply isn't there. For a document of such monumental significance, its complete disappearance raises serious questions for many historians. It's difficult to accept a claim of such magnitude when the central piece of evidence is missing, even with a compelling explanation for its absence.
Yet believers in the Meck have a powerful counterargument: compelling eyewitness accounts. Historical records describe how, in 1829, the North Carolina General Assembly created a select committee specifically to settle this controversy. They went to great lengths, reaching out to surviving participants or observers from the May 1775 meetings, even traveling as far as Georgia and Tennessee to gather their testimonies. This is a serious official inquiry by the state.
And the resulting 1831 report, it was 32 pages long, contain what were described as compelling eyewitness testimonies. And these came from individuals considered beyond reproach. These weren't just any old-timers. Several were decorated veterans of the American Revolution, men who had fought and bled for independence, and two, as we mentioned, were ordained Presbyterian ministers, figures of unquestionable moral standing and credibility in their communities. Their testimony was given under oath, and they had no obvious reason to invent such a story, decades later.
Right. For example, John Davidson's account states, quote, "When the members met and were perfectly organized for business, a motion was made to declare ourselves independent of the Crown of Great Britain, which was carried by a large majority." That's pretty direct and unambiguous, isn't it? Even given it was nearly 55 years after the fact.
It is direct. And there's the combined account of George Graham, William Hutchinson, Jonas Clark, and Robert Robinson. They stated that on the 20th, they again met with a committee under the direction of the delegates, had formed several resolves which were read and which went to declare themselves, and the people of Mecklenburg County free and independent of the King and Parliament of Great Britain. So this testimony explicitly ties the events to a declaration of independence on May 20th using language that closely mirrors the spirit of a formal declaration. The consistency across multiple highly respected witnesses is a strong point for proponents.
Definitely.
Beyond eyewitnesses, supporters also point to John McNitt Alexander's rough notes. These notes, though described as fragmentary and rough and undated and torn, are still presented as communicating a clear picture of the events of May 1920. They include the crucial detail of the solemn and awful vote to dissolve abjured our allegiance to King George and the British nation. What kind of weight do these notes carry, given their condition? Well, despite their physical state, these notes are considered significant by proponents because they are a contemporaneous, or at least near contemporaneous, record from a key participant. Alexander was the clerk of the committee, so his notes would likely have been a direct record of the proceedings. While rough notes might not be a polished official document, they offer a glimpse into the immediate thoughts and actions of those involved. The phrase solemn and awful vote conveys the immense gravity of the decision, hinting at a formal and deeply considered act of breaking allegiance, which for the time was a truly treasonous act carrying the penalty of death.
And to cap it off, the 1831 Governor's Report itself came to a very strong conclusion. It affirmed that it will be fully verified that as early as the month of May 1775, a portion of the people of North Carolina did, by a public and solemn act, declare the dissolution of the ties which bound them to the Crown and people of Great Britain, and did establish an independent, though temporary government for their own control and direction. For proponents, this official report, based on direct testimony and investigation, is definitive proof.
Yeah, this official state endorsement lent considerable weight to the MECDEC's authenticity at the time. It was certainly an attempt by the state of North Carolina to claim its rightful place in the early narrative of American independence, asserting its first-in-freedom status. However, it's also important to remember that such reports can sometimes be influenced by a desire to promote local pride or, a particular historical narrative. Objectivity can be tricky.
Okay. However, the skeptics have a powerful unifying theory that hinges on a crucial discovery made years after that official North Carolina report. In 1838, historian Peter Force unearthed a series of resolves from a committee in Charlottetown dated May 31st, 1775. These became known as the Mecklenburg Resolves.
Right, the resolves. And these, in contrast to the MECDEC, are unarguable in their existence. Peter Force, a meticulous collector of American historical documents, discovered them reprinted in contemporary newspapers from 1775, like the South Carolina Gazette. This provided concrete, verifiable historical evidence. While the original physical document was apparently later lost for a period, its rediscovery in 1838, combined with the newspaper publications, solidified their place in history as undisputed.
So the skeptics' unifying theory essentially says that when the witnesses gave their testimony in the 1830s, some 50 years after the fact, well, they were old, and their memories had conflated two separate events. They combined a true event, the signing of the Mecklenburg Resolves, with a fictitious one, the Mecklenburg Declaration. The whole MECDEC story becomes a case of mistaken identity.
It's a compelling theory of mistaken identities, yeah? It's rooted in the understanding of how human memory works, especially over long periods. As individuals age, and as events become imbued with greater historical significance, it's not uncommon for details from similar but distinct occurrences to merge in the mind. The Meck controversy thus serves as a powerful case study in how collective memory, especially when tied to foundational myths and community pride, can shape historical narratives. Even when meticulous documentation is absent or contradictory, it forces us to ask, what is the truth when an entire community believes something deeply, despite conflicting evidence?
And the key distinction for skeptics lies in the language. While the resolves were radical resolutions, they argued they fell short of an actual declaration of independence. They proclaimed laws derived from the king or parliament, annulled and vacated, and established a provisional government. But in this theory, they did not constitute a full, explicit declaration of separation from the British crown. This remains the crux of the Mecklenburg Declaration controversy.
Precisely. For skeptics, there's a crucial legal and philosophical difference between annulling and vacating royal laws and establishing